For Western negotiators trying to build a nuclear agreement with Iran, an agreement that has to be verified, implemented, and trusted over years or decades, the absence of that fatwa is not a footnote, it's a foundational problem. One of the BBC's veteran diplomatic correspondents made the connection explicitly. In the Geneva talks of 2014 and 2015, Iran offered concessions it had never offered before. The new supreme leader may not offer those same concessions. The hardliners are in charge now in a way they weren't before. And there's now, in her words, even less trust on the Iranian side, which means negotiations will go even slower and be more complicated. Here's a number that appeared on Thursday and deserves its own moment of scrutiny: $300 billion. Sources close to Iran's Revolutionary Guards were claiming, after the signing, that the United States had agreed to $300 billion for the reconstruction of Iran. $300 billion. The U.S. has said nothing of the sort publicly. There is no American official, no administration briefing, no State Department readout that contains anything resembling a $300 billion commitment. So either this is Iranian domestic messaging, a number floated to the hardliner base to make the deal look like a financial triumph for Iran, regardless of what the document actually says. Or there's some provision buried in the text, perhaps around sanctions relief, frozen assets, or reconstruction guarantees, that Iranian officials are choosing to frame in maximally favorable terms to their domestic audience. Or, most unsettlingly, it represents a genuine gap between what the American negotiating team agreed to and what the Iranian negotiating team heard, set alongside the toll question, the nuclear timeline dispute, the sovereignty of the Strait claim, and you start to see a pattern, not one or two discrepancies, a systematic divergence in how each side is characterizing what was agreed. Across almost every major issue, this isn't unusual in diplomacy. Constructive ambiguity, leaving certain questions deliberately unresolved so both sides can claim victory to their domestic audiences, is a time-honored negotiating technique. The 2015 nuclear deal, the Oslo Accords, the Minsk agreements all relied on versions of it. But constructive ambiguity has a shelf life. It works until the moment implementation begins, and both sides discover that victory looks different in practice than in a press release. At that point, the ambiguity stops being constructive and starts being a trigger. The $300 billion rumor may be nothing, or it may be the first indicator of what the next 60 days are actually going to feel like. After everything, the MOU, the signatures, the oil prices dropping, the markets rallying, the G7 applause, in the southern Lebanese village of Kfar Tednet, an Israeli drone targeted a car and killed its driver, hours after the framework deal was signed. Iran insists that an end to the fighting in Lebanon is an integral part of the agreement. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful regional proxy, has thanked Tehran and welcomed the deal, which implicitly promises them some form of protection under the framework. Israel's defense minister says Israeli forces will not withdraw from areas seized in southern Lebanon. This is not a minor dispute about implementation details. This is a fundamental disagreement about whether the deal covers Lebanon at all. Israel's two stated objectives when this war began were the collapse of the Iranian regime and the end of Hezbollah. The regime hasn't collapsed. If anything, it's emerged from this war with what one correspondent called stronger standing than before. Hezbollah exists, has welcomed the deal, and is presumably expecting to benefit from it. From Israel's perspective, this is the nightmare scenario. Not that the war was lost on the battlefield, not that Iran proved stronger than expected, but that Washington cut a deal without Jerusalem, a deal that may, in its practical effect, freeze in place the very threat Israel went to war to eliminate. Israeli politicians across the entire spectrum are voicing versions of the same fear tonight. The far right says reject the ceasefire entirely. The center-right and opposition say this is a diplomatic failure. Even those who support the ceasefire are demanding that Israel's security interests, its own military presence in southern Lebanon, its own terms for what constitutes a threat, be determined in Jerusalem, not Washington.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's preparing to speak. His office says he'll address the nation, but the readout from his call with Trump, expressing appreciation for commitments about enriched uranium and missile production, suggests that Netanyahu is already trying to extract the maximum possible interpretation from a deal that, from Israel's perspective, delivered far less than was promised.
Every agreement has enemies, but this one is unusual in having powerful enemies on both sides simultaneously. And in those enemies drawing from deep wells of ideological commitment, not just political opportunism. On the Iranian side, the faction known as the Endurance Front, Jabhat Paidari, has spent the entire duration of these negotiations working to sabotage a deal. Their argument is theological and political at once. Any agreement with the United States represents capitulation. It betrays the legacy of the revolution. It opens the door to American influence that, once allowed in, cannot be expelled. These aren't fringe voices. They have seats in parliament. They have influence in the Revolutionary Guards, and their resentment now has a specific focal point. The accusation, already circulating in hardliner media, that Iran's top negotiators have betrayed the Islamic Republic's elite supreme leader, the same Khamenei who was killed on day one of this war. Martyrdom in Iranian political culture is not a rhetorical device. It is a live political force. Invoking Khamenei's memory in opposition to this deal is an extraordinarily powerful move, one that could, if it gains traction, make the deal politically toxic inside Iran, regardless of its merits. On the other side of the ledger, Israel's far right. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, who has previously been sanctioned by France and investigated by Italy, has said Israel should not accept this ceasefire. His political base has consistently pushed for more maximalist outcomes, regime change, full disarmament, Israeli military presence not just in southern Lebanon, but further north. Netanyahu, caught between an American president who wants to close the deal and a domestic coalition that sees the deal as a betrayal, has limited room to maneuver. If he endorses the MOU too enthusiastically, he risks losing his far-right coalition partners and potentially his government. If he rejects it, he risks a rupture with Washington that no Israeli prime minister can afford. The markets on Monday made their verdict clear. They believe this deal is real, or real enough. Oil prices dropped to a 3-month low. Global equities opened sharply higher. Shipping stocks moved. Insurance underwriters began adjusting Gulf risk premiums downward. After months of living with $90 plus oil, 4% global inflation, World Bank warnings about growth falling to 1.3%, and the prospect of 2 choke points simultaneously disrupting global supply chains, the markets inhaled deeply. And for the first time in a very long time, exhaled. The economics editor's framing was in many ways the most measured. Mild economic turbulence this year, rather than another crisis. Not a recovery, not a boom, just not another crisis. After the past 108 days, that alone feels like a reprieve. But there's a lag effect that's worth understanding. Even if the Strait fully reopens this week, and the mind-sweeping timeline suggests if is doing a lot of work in that sentence, the price rises of the past several months don't simply evaporate. Fertilizer prices that spiked because of this conflict will take time to normalize. Food prices downstream from those fertilizer costs will take longer still. The inflation that pushed the US to 4.2% will continue working its way through the system for months, regardless of what happens in the Strait. One correspondent described it well. Some of the price rises we've seen in recent months still have to work their way through. The supply chains that were disrupted don't resynchronize overnight. The shipping routes that were diverted around the Cape of Good Hope don't snap back instantaneously. The trade relationships, the insurance markets, the just-in-time logistics, all of it needs time. What we're likely looking at, even in the optimistic scenario where the MOU holds and negotiations progress, is a gradual unwinding over months. The immediate market reaction is hopeful. The underlying reality is more complicated. Relief is real, but it is slow. And underneath all of that, the question that may in the long run matter most of all, has this war actually made the world safer? Has it moved the dial on Iran's nuclear ambitions in a durable way? Or has it, as the critics increasingly argue, spent billions, burned through relationships, empowered hardliners on every side, and ultimately arrived at a framework that is, at best, no better than what patient diplomacy might have achieved without a single shot fired. If this series has helped you understand one of the most consequential conflicts of our time, subscribe, share it with someone who needs the context, and let us know in the comments, what do you think the 60 days will actually produce? Day 109 tomorrow. See you then.